It started. So
Hello,
come on in.
Debbie. How are you?
Hi, I'm doing well. Who's that?
This is Brian, Commissioner
Hi,
Harris,
Brian.
City of
How are
Richmond.
you? Welcome. Thank you for joining us.
You're
All
welcome.
right.
I was speaking ill of you today earlier in the meeting.
You were speaking ill of me.
No,
Outstanding.
that's a
Thank you.
figure of speech right here, meaning I was talking good things about you.
Oh, okay. Phew. I was worried. My ears were burning.
Yeah, your ears are burned.
All right. I'm glad to see Shirley Crone here and Mariana Moore. Oh my gosh, some of my favorite humans are in this room right now. Renita, David, Warren. Oh my gosh, Zenit. Oh my gosh, it just gets more and more exciting. But we're gonna go ahead and get started because we have a lot to pack into this hour. So thank you everybody for joining us. So just quickly, I'm Debbie Toth. I'm with an organization called Choice in Aging. We've been around for 75 years. And we are really hyper-focused on how transportation is the access that people need to get to services, supports, freedom, education, enjoyment, all of those things. But yet, if you have a disability or you're an elder, you can't use transportation in the way that you need to in order to reach the things you need. And we're trying to solve for that problem. So thank you for joining us today. You can expect to hear from a little introduction from Adina, who's going to kick it off to Kaleo at Seamless Bay Area. They are one of my absolute favorite organizations that didn't get born to serve people with disabilities, but has totally embraced the justice aspect of disability rights. And Kalea is going to talk to us about some research that's been done. Adina is then going to talk about some policy recommendations that we have and funding reform opportunities. And then we're going to open it up to questions and answers and discussion. I would like to encourage everybody to introduce themselves in the chat if they are able. I would also like to encourage you throughout this presentation, please share your thoughts and ideas in the chat and your questions. We want to know, what are your ideas for other education and policy opportunities related to this, as well as how do we build coalition around it? So quickly, why am I doing this? Why do I care? Well, I have been at Choice in Aging for 22 years. And in that 22 years, I have consistently seen again and again that the folks we serve at our adult day healthcare programs are subject to the kind of transportation that is not accessible, it's not affordable, and it's not appropriate for their needs. I have seen people who are at risk for skilled nursing facility placement who have mid to late stage Alzheimer's disease spend 3 hours on a trip to go 7 miles. I have seen things you can't imagine, like somebody with late stage dementia being dropped off at somebody else's home and left. I have seen all kinds of things, and it's not okay. It's not okay. And we need to do better. So that's my why. And it's been my why for a very long time. And I've been fortunate to partner with John Cunningham in Contra Costa County. And we actually have an accessible transportation strategic plan that we're working on implementing in this county. So I'm very excited about that. But we really need a revolution when it comes to accessible transportation. So I'm going to hand it off to my partner, Adina, who's going to do a brief introduction and then bring Kaleo on. So thank you all for joining us. Adina, take it away.
Okay. And so let me bring up a screen share for a second. So my name is Adina Levin, and I'm the advocacy director with Seamless Bay Area. We are a nonprofit supporting seamlessly integrated, rider-friendly, equitable, and accessible public transportation in the Bay Area and increasingly in California. And we were one of the first things I want to start with is a question that probably many of you have in your head before we start to dive in, which is about what happened with AB 540. So last year, we were extremely fortunate to have Assemblymember Wicks bring forward a bill, the Social Services Transportation Improvement Act, with a goal of putting into law recommendations from the 2020 Master Plan for Aging Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and really recommendations for decades of studies recommending improvements in accessible transportation. And what that bill did was it called for increased coordination amongst service providers by strengthening Consolidated Transportation Services Agency, and it also called for bringing in needed new revenue to fund improved accessible transportation. So what happened? Well, in very brief, very briefly, the progress last year in a tough budget year was hampered. The issue wasn't just that it was going to cost money to improve accessible transportation, but that no one even had any clue to begin with about how much it costs to even to run, let alone to improve accessible transportation. And that huge gap about knowledge of the costs was a big blocker, especially in a tough budget year. So the bill was allowed to die in the Assembly Transportation Committee. But really surfacing that question that nobody even knows how much the system costs and how much it would cost to improve it has opened up a significant opportunity for progress in the coming couple of years that we'll talk about before we are done. And also in the process of having a bill in the field opened up additional opportunities for education, learning, and coalition building about what are the needs for policy reforms to improve accessible transportation, and the opportunity to do even more education and coalition building so that we have a broad network of support for reforms. Another thing that came up in that conversation is a question, well, you have 2 decades of studies, but are things the same? There's new technologies, there's new innovations happening around the country. Are these recommendations for the last 20 years even still valid? And so I'm going to turn over to my colleague, Kaleo Marks, who worked with Mary Lynn Lampe, who is also on this call in doing current contemporary research focus groups with users of accessible transportation and service providers and case studies all around the country. And I'll turn it over to Kaleo to talk about what was learned. And then before we are done, there are many people who are users of the accessible transportation system and will want to hear about, is this summary accurate in terms of your experience, or are there other things that you would also want to uplift in terms of needs for improvement? Handing it over to Kaleo.
Thanks, Adina. Could you by chance share the slides?
Yep. Yes. All right. Is this the here we go, guys.
Perfect. All right. Thank you. Hi, everyone. As Adina said, my name is Kaleo. I work at Seamless Bay Area, and along with Mary and many others, worked on compiling these rider focus groups and service provider surveys to get a better understanding of the challenges that we face in California. Next slide, please. So what are the challenges that riders face? Over the course of 2023, our partners at Genesis hosted 3 different focus groups with riders with cognitive disabilities, riders with physical disabilities, and their caregivers to get a better understanding of the day-to-day experience and to learn exactly what challenges they face. And through that process, we learned that there were 4 major improvements that riders want to see. First of which was about decreasing trip travel times. As Debbie said, trips on accessible transportation can sometimes take 2 to 4 times longer than it would take to drive or take fixed route transit. And this is a major barrier for riders and is a serious equity concern that we have. Secondly, riders want to see more reliable and frequent service in more areas at more times. We talked to a rider in Santa Rosa who wasn't able to accept a job opportunity because, you know, she was going to work from 3 to 11 p.m. and paratransit stopped operating in her area at 8 p.m. So under the current system, we see this serious limitation of work and social opportunities. Thirdly, riders really wanted vehicles that meet everyone's accessibility needs, and this includes more robust operator training. We spoke to riders who used powered wheelchairs that were not compatible with a lot of vehicles that were being offered. And we also spoke to riders who requested overhead speakers on vehicles to announce locations, either because they had hearing issues or whether they were blind or had other accessibility needs. And lastly, riders all wanted to see more connections between them and decision makers. We know that riders ride these systems and they have the expertise, and talking to these people in power would really help decision makers understand the challenges they face. Next slide, please. Oh, Ashley, one back. Okay, thank you. So after talking to riders, we also wanted to talk to operators to understand what their needs were. And honestly, there was a lot of overlap between what operators saw as issues and what riders saw as issues. First and foremost being there was a need for more robust operations. As riders identified, operators also identified a need for more accessible vehicles, whether that be wheelchair lifts on vehicles. They also identified a need to expand service areas with longer hours and with more locations. Identified a need to hire and retain workers with higher pay, and also to fund the purchasing and operating of more vehicles. They also identified streamlining user experiences as an important aspect, whether that be an ability for users to pay with fare cards, transit fare cards, and credit and debit cards, and also decreasing eligibility wait times for first-time users that are just getting into the system. There's also a need to deepen coordination efforts, and we will talk about that more in the case study section. But just as a little overview, many operators wanted to get on the same standardized software to make cross-regional trips or transfers easier for users. And also there was a need to coordinate with social services agencies, standardizing eligibility processes, staff training, and more. And lastly, operators also identified that getting more riders in public meetings and on policy and advisory bodies would help them improve how they serve their communities. Next slide, please. So with all those current needs and what we learned from riders and operators, we really wanted to look to other regions to see how they are improving and strengthening their regional coordination and government structures. So this took us to 5 different states, one of those being California, and we can just jump straight into it. So next slide, please. So in Florida, one interesting thing that they are doing is they have a very structured system for how paratransit is governed. So at the state level, there is a state agency that is tasked with policy development and oversight. And then localities are provided with implementing that service vision and also planning goals. This is a much more rationalized and streamlined system than we see here in California. California takes a much more lax and fragmented approach to coordination. So I think this Florida example can really highlight how a more coherent system would work. Next slide, please. So what does that actually look like? As I mentioned, at the state level, they have an organization known as the Commission for the Transportation Disadvantaged, and they are tasked with developing policies and procedures to coordinate service. The Commission for the Transportation Disadvantaged is an independent agency housed within the Florida Department for Transportation. So they have all their own rules making and budgetary authority. Their board is made up of 7 members, and importantly, 2 of those members have to be people with disabilities that ride on the system, and 1 of their members must be someone that is 65 years or older. And then looking at the local level and how this is implemented, there are 3 entities that really are important for understanding this picture. Probably the most tangible one being the community transportation coordinators. So these operate at a county level within Florida's 67 counties, and they are responsible for providing service. They also do mobility management for riders and are helping sorry, and are helping with all other coordination needs. Designated official planning agencies are tasked with studying and also conducting plans for how local service gets implemented and any improvements that can be done in the future. And then lastly, local coordination boards are advisory bodies that assist with identifying local needs. And these are often made up of local elected officials, riders, state agencies, and other interested parties. Next slide, please. The next case study that we looked into were actually 2 regions, but we identified that they offer similar improvements, so we just kind of bundled them into one slide. This being the RIDES program in Harris County, Texas, and also the Regional Transportation Collaborative Program in Virginia. The key takeaway from both these case studies were that regions, they were both successful in creating a centralized booking system and also implementing staff and resource sharing programs that really help them improve accessible transportation services in their area. So what does this look like? Both of these regions lack ADA paratransit in as robust way as a region, say the Bay Area. So for example, in this region of Virginia, it encompasses 6 counties and has a population of about 100,000. So they lack any ADA paratransit system. So what they are doing is coordinating nonprofit organizations, community organizations, and municipalities to provide these services. And one way they do this is by getting all of these different providers on the same software, and this helps avoid duplicative services and open up more vehicles and more drivers to serve more riders in an efficient manner. In Virginia specifically, they are implementing a program that shares resources and staffing across different nonprofits to help, with any of their marketing or mobility management or volunteer coordination needs. So all in all, as of 2023, they had 12 shared staff across 5 different nonprofit organizations. And the person I talked to who does the management of the organization said this has really helped boost organizational capacity for these organizations. Additionally, we know that there are a large amount of infrastructure costs that are associated with any transportation system. So they have implemented a shared vehicle program. 7 service providers share 11 vehicles so that this is able to reduce any overhead infrastructure costs that they might not be able to pay right now, but also to provide more rides. And then lastly, in Virginia, they are doing something which I'm really personally interested in and is cool, known as a collaborative grant application program. And what they do is the regional entity will identify a lead organization, nonprofit organization, to apply for any state, local, or federal application. And the regional manager also mentioned that this has really helped them attract investors because they view these joint applications as being more stable and better suited for grant funding in the long term. Next slide, please. Next, we took a we took a look at the Find My Ride Apply program, which is happening in Pennsylvania, a very recent innovation. But essentially what it is the state DOT decided to create an online application portal for people that are applying for paratransit. And they are giving that to local transit agencies to use. And this has benefited both riders and transit agencies in many ways, one of which being it created a standardized online application for paratransit. Prior to Find My Ride Apply, all agencies had in-person paper-based applications. Some agencies even had online applications, but they were usually cumbersome and still required applicants to go in person to either show ID or some other form of verification. So with this new system, it allows riders to simply do all of the eligibility stuff online and not require any cumbersome or difficult application process. It also helps simplify the discount eligibility process. The application essentially requires users to put in some basic information about themselves, and using the software, it's able to automatically match riders up with the programs that would give them the most benefit in terms of discount. And then lastly, this program really helped reduce administrative burden for local transit agencies. A paper-based system really took a lot of staff time away, as in they would have to manually input all the information in their local systems. And then sometimes there were errors on applications, so they would have to go back to riders and ask them to like make the appropriate changes. But with this online system, it's all automatically input to a centralized data processing system, and it really helped reduce any errors that were on applications. Next slide, please. And then lastly, we have an example from California taking place in the San Francisco Bay Area. We have the Transit Transformation Action Plan. And this is really a regional effort by MTC, which is the Bay Area's metropolitan planning organization. And they are doing some key initiatives to facilitate coordination amongst accessible transportation services. It's actually a broader effort to coordinate governance of fixed route transit too, but today we'll be focusing on the accessible stuff. So there are 5 main reforms that they are focusing on, one of which being mobility management. They're seeking to create mobility managers in each county that will coordinate rides and act as a liaison between multiple transit agencies. So in the Bay Area, there are 27 different transit operators. So each county might have maybe 1 operator or maybe 5. So they really want to implement the system to help reduce and make.
Sorry about that.
Oh, no, it's okay. Thank you. And to help riders find any resources they may need to complete their rides. They're also funding one-seat pilot projects. And for those that are maybe not familiar with this is essentially a program that allows riders to take one vehicle across jurisdictions. This really reduces, travel times by making it so that people don't have to make transfers, and it also will lead to cost-sharing agreements between agencies to implement this program. The Transit Transformation Action Plan is also looking at integrating paratransit into the regional fare payment system known as Clipper Card, so that people don't have to go through each agency to pay for their system. They're also working to standardize eligibility processes for people with disabilities. Currently, every agency has their own way of verifying if someone is eligible, but through this program, they want to create 3 different categories, essentially, for people to be eligible. And then lastly, through some regional planning processes, they're hoping to identify key paratransit challenges and then make recommendations. So those are the case studies that we looked at. I'll be turning it back to Adina to kind of give a policy background of what has happened at the state level in California, and then we'll review some of our policy recommendations.
All right. Thanks, Kaleo. And something to really highlight, Kaleo, the research that Kaleo just reported only emphasizes the recommendations that have come forward from a variety of studies over the last 2 decades. So just as one example, a Caltrans report in 2012 said that the current system provides inefficient and ineffective service with gaps, inconsistencies, duplication, and underutilization of resources, inconsistent safety standards, and an inconvenient experience for customers. So these are not in any way things that are new, and what our recommendations are building on 2 decades of studies going back to the early 2000s from the Health and Human Services Agency, Caltrans, Department of Aging, and more. The research that we have recently done and the case studies reinforce the conclusions of the previous research, and also even with the changes and the things that there are new, it is really, and all the more so, a need to improve our fragmented accessible transportation system. And there are technology improvements that can help with that coordination, along with the institutional reforms that have been needed for many years. So I'll talk about the policy recommendations. And in a tough budget climate in the state of California, we do have a really significant opportunity in the next 1 to 2 years to make progress. So I said that one of the roadblocks in moving forward legislation was the fact that the funding needs for accessible transportation are a mystery. And that word was actually used in one of the reports that we drew upon. Fortunately, there are 2 current initiatives authorized by state law to assess and make recommendations about transportation fundings. And these initiatives should assess and make recommendations for funding to implement the improvements that come out of the previous studies. So these 2 initiatives are SB 1121 from a law passed in 2022 that requires the California Transportation Commission with CalSTA and Caltrans to prepare a needs assessment of the cost to operate, maintain, and provide for future growth of all transportation in California, with a report that is due on or before January 1st, 2025, and then every 5 years thereafter. So this is the entire transportation system, including accessible transportation. And then in parallel to this, there is a task force that was required by SB 125 from last year's 2023 budget bill that requires CalSTA to convene a task force making recommendations regarding transit funding for the state of California and improving the transit experience for all users and growing and supporting transit ridership. And CalSTA, with the task force, is required to submit its reports of findings and policy recommendations on or before October 31st, 2025. So the significant opportunity here is to make sure that these processes that are happening do a robust job of assessing the funding needs for accessible transportation. There is a very recent letter with requests to these processes to do a robust job of this funding assessment. And as a follow-up from this meeting, we can share this letter for others that may also wish to see this funding assessment to appropriately assess the funding needs for accessible transportation. Given that funding was, very much lifted up by the state of the system for riders and by the operators that describe their needs to make improvements. Speaking of funding in the current challenging financial climate, even before we talk about making reforms, our research identified some opportunities to better guide existing funding. So for example, in our California case studies, we identified an opportunity to better utilize local coordinated plan funding guidance for federal funding. So federal law requires locally developed coordinated plans to guide Section 5310 federal funding for transit dependent and transit disadvantaged people, including elderly and people with disabilities. And however, there is some gaps between what these coordinated plans actually called for in terms of the prioritization and the way that that funding is actually spent. And so there are opportunities to improve the alignment between the federal funding and how that federal funding is used in accordance with those local coordinated plans. And there's a similar opportunity to improve the alignment for state funding. So there is what is called an unmet needs process, where the California's Transportation Development Act, or TDA, requires jurisdictions to identify unmet needs and those needs that are reasonable to meet in order to guide that state TDA funding. And so the determination of unmet needs should consider those needs identified in the coordinated plans to make sure that those state funds can be used for coordinated plan implementation to improve accessible transportation. And there should be a public review process to provide transparency so that these state funds are going as they ought to in order to support accessible transportation. So even with the funding we have, there's opportunities to do a better job of guiding that funding to support accessible transportation. Next, I'll talk about some opportunities for institutional reforms that will require additional funding to implement. And these come out of the many years of previous studies as refined by some of our learnings from the case studies that and user research and surveys that Kaleo just reported. So first, because institutional reform is a complex topic and not a single, point in time set of changes, we're picking up recommendation from multiple studies to establish a California Mobility Council with authority over the reform of the implementation of the Social Services Transportation Improvement Act from back in 1979. And then two additional families of institutional reforms. One is enhancing the Consolidated Transportation Services Agency mechanism. This was a mechanism that was called for back in 1979 for the purposes of improving transportation for low mobility groups and achieving cost savings and more efficient use of resources. And Caltrans and the Department of Aging have recommended strengthening these CTSAs and requiring them in every county so that they would receive and allocate funding and lead coordination initiatives. So this is something that there have been some CTSAs established in various different places around the state, but they are relatively few and far between. And so one of the policy recommendations is to strengthen these. The initial concept of a CTSA was at the county level. However, we're also starting to see some important innovation in the coordination of accessible transportation at the regional level. So in Kaleo's case study of the Bay Area, there is a regional network management entity being set up that is leading coordination not only at the county level, but across counties in the region, in a 9-county region. So for example, in the one-seat paratransit ride pilot that the MTC is leading with agencies, that is allowing trips not only across multiple service providers within a county, but across the counties. So we see this regional network management in the Bay Area as a potential good practice that could be used in other regions as well. With these different institutional reforms, there's a variety of coordination opportunities. Let me go back to the slide. That can be done at a variety of different levels. So first is to standardize the eligibility. This is, all right, sorry about that. This is something that we heard of from several of our from the case studies. This is something that the Bay Area is starting to do within the Transformation Action Plan. And this is establishing a single set of criteria and a streamlined process to qualify for accessible transportation services. And it is beneficial that this is being done at a regional level in the Bay Area, but even more broadly than that, there's opportunities to standardize eligibility at the state level along the lines of the case study that Kaleo had mentioned. And there is the Cal ITP project is working on some tools and technologies to help standardize eligibility at the state level as well. Other coordination opportunities, building off of the previous recommendations as well as the case studies, is mobility management, providing that single point of contact, connecting users of accessible transportation with the most appropriate service for their needs. And as we have learned from the case studies that Kaleo mentioned, there are opportunities now to support this with some standardized booking software to provide a convenient experience and to provide a more efficient and cost-effective provision of the service. The cross-jurisdictional service that came up in the case studies, including in that Bay Area pilot, there's an opportunity to have policies that deliver this type of cross-jurisdictional service in more counties and more regions around the state. And last but not least is including in the capability of a CTSA, the ability to review the accessibility of the transportation system using sidewalks and paths. These are really critical for mobility equity. And while the sidewalks and paths and so on are, it's important for them to be controlled at the local level for the cities and jurisdictions that are in charge of the streets and the sidewalks. It would be valuable to have the CTSA at the county level to be empowered to review those capital improvements in order to ensure consistent and improving accessibility for people with disabilities and seniors. And these are some slides that I'll take if there's any questions about the institutional structure. And with that, I'm going to hand this back to Debbie, who will moderate a Q&A. We'll be happy to take questions about any of the things that we presented in terms of the case studies, the surveys, the focus groups, the policy recommendations. From your personal experience as a user, is this something that echoes with you, or is there anything important that is missing in the policy recommendations? Is there anything important that is missing? And then importantly, this is a valuable conversation to be having here with this group. Who else? What other groups? What other venues would you see in terms of wanting to build up the set of people that are aware of, educated on, and are available to help uplift the need for improved accessible transportation in the state of California? Debbie, thanks to Kaleo for presenting and Debbie for the moderation of the Q&A.
Yeah, so that wasn't a big ask there at the end, Adina. Just everybody think huge and big and wild. It would be great if we could all somehow be in the room together without spotlighting or whatever it is. So Rachel, if you're able to just have us all be in the room chilling together, that would be awesome. First, I want to go to, I think Jeffrey had his hand up first from memory. Jeffrey, if you want to unmute and ask your question.
Well, some information and others' sake is through their dealing with, there is right now an effort of making a statewide, in a sense, debit card accessibility. Granted, it has nothing to do with what you're talking about, but just the question is, are you aware of that? Because I know we're in Sacramento, we are trying to see, since the disability or discountability is not available at the state level yet, we are working trying to make it available in Sacramento and intending on using the next thing of the for our go-to ride, transit rides that are kind of like the Uber service complement, where it's $5 for a ride to go through there. But what I do want to bring out to you is there's another service coming from Virginia called Visa. And it's basically dealing with, for really the blind individuals really like it because it gives them door-to-door service. But it's not, we'll call, fully accessible, because it's only people that are fully mobile that might have a service animal that can use it. And again, how that qualifies for dealing with the accessibility components is something I think I didn't see anything in there that addressed or directed anything about that, because, like service animals, it's a difference that a lot of people are not aware of, just like labeling and marketing. Okay.
Jeffrey, thank you. Yes, I think you bring up a lot of really good points, and Adina and Kaleo were vociferously nodding their heads as you were talking. Yes, they're aware. Yes, they're plugged in. I do want to make the statement, and then I will give the mic to Adina if she wants to respond, that accessible transportation is not a one-size-fits-all solution. There need to be multiple different solutions for multiple different people, just like we don't all drive cars, right? Some people do motorcycles, some people do mopeds, some people do bicycles, some people walk, some people use wheelchairs. Like, we don't have a one size fits all, and it's going to take all of these things to create an affordable, accessible, appropriate system for everyone to be able to use it. So I'm going to, Adina, did you want to add?
Yeah, so in the recommendation about the statewide eligibility verification, that's the Cal ITP system that is also working on the ability to pay with your debit card and get a discount with your debit card. And they are going to be rolling out eligibility verification with Medi-Cal, I think, in October, and for other disability eligibility by the end of the year. So yes, there are some really important opportunities to streamline eligibility and be able to pay with a debit or credit card and get the discount to which you are entitled. In terms of having the door-to-door service and being accessible, this is something where there is a state law in California about making point-to-point, like a Lyft or an Uber, providing accessible service. And there are people on this call that have a more up-to-date knowledge about the rollout and implementation of this law from several years ago. So that's a very good question that there might be others that have a better answer to.
Okay, thank you, Adina. Warren, you're up next. Can you unmute?
And while Warren is unmuting, there's a critical point that I left out in terms of the governance recommendations, which is, modeled after the Florida case study, is ensuring that the institutions that are set up have people with disabilities, with lived experience, that are on these various different bodies to ensure that it is meeting the needs of people with the experience of using the system. Warren, can you unmute?
I think he just lowered his hand, so maybe he didn't have a question. I was going to elevate some conversation that's happening in the chat right now around CTSA and structures, and I'm hoping that John Cunningham can unmute and just provide us some. So we're having conversation in the chat around the CTSA. Could it be a paratransit coordinating council? Could it be MTC? No, it can't be either one of those. Why? What is it? Can you talk about that structure, John?
Yeah, can folks hear me?
Yes.
I can jump in and respond. I think there's at least a couple other people that might have more background on this than I have. But the CTSA is a designation. It's not a type of organization or an organization itself, but that designation needs to be applied to either a nonprofit agency or a government agency, and it has to be an entity, sort of along the lines of something organization that can sue and be sued, that type of test. So a committee would not meet that test. I hope that helps. The CTSA designation just confers some privileges and options under state law. So it's sort of a label that gets put on typically an existing organization.
Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And I also wanted to speak to another part of the chat conversation with the graphic that I had skipped, but it did come up in conversation. So what does the MTC's regional network management role, how does that relate to CTSAs? And the answer, and this was as reviewed by Drennan Shelton with MTC, who's on this call. So Drennan, please correct me if I got anything garbled, but these are complementary, where a CTSA would coordinate accessible transportation service within the county, serving as the mobility manager, enabling the one-seat ride within the county, and so on. And then the regional network manager would coordinate accessible transportation initiatives across the region, including ensuring standardization and coordination across different counties. So in regions that have a network manager, they can provide that cross-county functionality. And in regions that do not have a network manager, the county becomes the the level that would allocate the funding, be the mobility manager, enable one-seat rides, and so on.
You say allocate the funding, that's assuming that there is funding, which historically there has not been funding. So this is the failure of the legislation initially that was passed that created in 1978. I'm looking at John Cunningham. Is it 79?
79.
I'm always trying to get that year right, and I'm always getting it wrong. All right, 1979, when the CTSA concept was created, it wasn't funded. And I think this is something really important for this group to hear. In the absence of funding, policy means nothing. So we can pass all kinds of legislation, but if we don't fund implementation, we are just creating more shelf decorations. So I think our sort of push at this point in time is, first of all, I think most human beings who don't have somebody in their life that they love who has experienced a lack of ability to get from point A to point B when they want to get there, don't think about it. They don't understand it. They have no education and no concept of it. And so part of this is we need to educate. This is a disability justice issue, 100%. So how do we educate? How do we compel? We know, as Adina mentioned in the beginning, she said 20 years of studies. I want to say there's 30 years of studies, and all of them point to the same things over and over and over, and yet we don't put the funding to make the changes to implement what the studies tell us to do. So what we're hoping to do is to create solid policy that is attached to budget numbers so that there can be some implementation, but we need to be able to educate. We need to be able to get our policy correct. We need to be able to create a tsunami of advocates who are out there saying this has to be done. So my question is, how do we do that? Who do we need to talk to? How do we convene? So share with us, what are your thoughts on this? And I mean, I see Shirley Crone on here, and we're going to be pitching her to lift the legislation through the California Senior Legislature. Like, you know, we have some ideas around stuff like that. And we're not here to talk about that piece of it. We're here to talk about, how do we educate? How do we change minds? How do we coalesce around this? How do we activate around this? Like, what are your thoughts and ideas about this? Who else should be in this room? Somebody put in the chat earlier, are there any senators? I think it was Mary. Mary's always calling me out. Are there any senators in the room? Are there any assembly members in the room? Like, who's not in here who needs to be in here? I was very happy to see there was a reverend in the room. This is the first time we've gotten like spiritual going on in this meeting. So that's fantastic. I see people I don't know in this room. That is fantastic. Like, there are new people here, but who's not here who needs to be here? So that's my question to you, and I'm hoping that you are able to give some feedback or some thoughts around this. We need champions in both the Senate and Assembly. Yes, we absolutely do. So I think that we're starting, I mean, I've been having these conversations with the elected officials that I have relationships with. But again, like with Assemblymember Buffy Wicks, we actually got legislation for a minute. There was like hope for a minute. So, I mean, I feel like that's cracking the door. John can tell you we've been at this for 22 years, and that was the biggest crack we've seen. So there was some hope provided there. So Jeffrey, go ahead. What do you want to add? Jeffrey, are you able to unmute?
Well, that's why in Sacramento, tried to get RT to come up with the Citizens Academy, because a goal is they want more dollars for local public transportation. So that's why I encouraged and got Regional Transit to come up with a Citizens Academy. So we get 25 graduates basically every 6 months coming out of there that will then talk about what needed in Sacramento. We need to replicate that and get other places that are needing transportation to understand exactly what we want and take it to a few events that we know there's going to be like-minded people or events. You know, we're going to Earth Day because we know there's a lot of like-minded people in the EV institution, which does anyway, nothing to do with transportation, but it's dealing with making sure that they see that we have accessibility needs and getting them to recognize what needs need to be accommodated. And that's the purpose right now in Sacramento that we're working for 2026 to go after a means of getting local transportation dollars here. Because we don't have enough to do any of the things that are really needed. And that's what I think is with the rural areas is the same thing. We need to find out what we can do that will give us the biggest bang for the buck. But the biggest part of education is getting out there and talking to the people, the groups, and getting, you know, your, as you say, local representatives, support them so they support us.
Thank you. I want to point out John McPherson put in the chat, not to be a downer. Thank you for not saying not to be a Debbie Downer, because I get that a lot. But the budget situation is so dire that we need a long range plan. And we agree 100%, John. Like, we are not in a situation right now where we're going to see spending happen on something new, right? Like, we're seeing spending cut from things that exist, or big money grabs from pots of money, but we won't go into that. But what we were looking to do, and some of the conversations that we were having behind the scenes looked at, we have a couple of Senate bills that created task forces that are in charge of costing out transportation in California and getting representation on those bodies to lift the voice of accessible transportation so that it gets included in the cost of providing transportation. So it's not necessarily a separate bill, but I mean, these are the kinds of conversations that we're having around how do we make this work? Like, we are thinking so far outside of the box, it's amazing. But we need to get support for it. And I think part of it is, at least in my experience, we think of accessibility as an add-on rather than as part of the base infrastructure of anything we do. And so when we sprinkle accessibility on at the end, it becomes an afterthought and inaccessible. So we need to figure out how we get in the root of and create accessible transportation as part of our budget and thinking when we begin stuff. So I don't know, Adina, did you want to add something to that?
Not directly, no, although I want to lift up the conversation that's been happening in the chat about the need to have staff educated in Sacramento. And one opportunity to do that is to potentially have an informational hearing, which is can be a good way to educate staff about a topic.
So that's a
And-
great idea. So let
yeah.
me just ask, of all the people that are in this room right now, and I'm not talking to Carol at California Department of Aging or Renita, but like those of you who are not state staff people, is that something that you would come to if we held an informational hearing? And could you get turnout? Let's say we got a really big space. Could we fill the room with 200 or 300 advocates to do the informational hearing for 10 legislators and really have some voice and some presence? Is that something that folks here are willing to do? Are you
But,
willing to show up? Michelle, you gonna show up?
It's still accessibility. Some of the people who need to come to fight won't be able to get there. And
That's
then
right.
also, as far as you know, accessibility, a lot of times to find transportation, you know, the people who need it need to have what you call computer skills. So some of that, you know, is accessibility is across the board.
Yes, 100%. And we agree. So if we were to arrange for transportation for folks who wanted to come, how's that? Christine, give us the last word. We've got just a minute left. So go ahead and share your thoughts, Christine. Do I have to ask you to unmute? I don't know. Sorry, I'm clearly not the best Zoom operator.
Thank you. So, I like the idea of having a conference, or, you know, really great idea. I think one of the biggest things that any number of people don't understand is, well, there's a two-parter to this. So the first thing is, a lot of people really don't understand what paratransit is all about.
Yeah.
What it is, how it works, all that kind of stuff. But the other biggie is they don't fully understand that it's not a free it's not a free ride, and there's a lot of challenges that go along with it. It's not even Uber. You can't right now. You can't set up a ride the same day.
Yeah, there are a lot of barriers, and I think that would be part of building it, Christine. Thank you. I think that would be part of building the informational hearing, is really setting the framework for what is available, the paratransit, because it's not available in rural. It's not available for people who live outside a 3/4 mile radius. It's not available for people who want to do something at 10 o'clock at night. It's not available. Like, anyway, that's going to be part of what our educational hearing is going to be about. We are at time. I want to thank everybody for being here. I want to apologize profusely for missing on the captioning. I am committed to seeing if we can get the recording of this captioned and then send it out to everybody. Thank you for being here. And please know that we are going to keep reaching out to you and asking you to engage. If you have ideas or thoughts, Adina put her information in the chat. Mary Lynn put her information in the chat. You know how to find us at Choice in Aging. Thank you for being here, and let's fix this broken system, everybody. Be well. Thank you, Adina. Thank you, Kaleo. Bye, everybody.